Father left me at 5 years and remarried. I grew up with my grandmother, and when my stepmother found out about my inheritance, she wanted to take everything. But I acted decisively and did. The first memory I have of my father is of him leaving. I was 5 years old, clutching my favorite teddy bear, watching as he packed his bags and walked out the door without looking back. I stood there, tiny and heartbroken, my grandmother's comforting hand resting on my shoulder, and all I could think was that I must have done something terribly wrong to make him leave. I was told later that he was moving to start a new life with his new wife, Sophia. I didn't understand what that meant back then. All I knew was that he was gone, and he wasn't coming back. Grandma did her best to explain it, but there's only so much a child can grasp. I grew up feeling as though a piece of me was missing, a piece that my father had taken with him when he chose to leave. My grandmother was my rock. She took me in without hesitation, raising me in a sprawling house that had belonged to our family for generations. It was grand, with tall ceilings, elegant chandeliers, and sprawling gardens where I spent countless afternoons exploring. To me, it was more than a home. It was a world where I could escape, a fortress where I was safe from the pain of being left behind. As I grew older, Grandma would tell me stories about our family's legacy, stories of wealth and resilience, of ancestors who had built fortunes and made names for themselves. There were portraits lining the walls, paintings of stern-looking men and women whose eyes seemed to follow me wherever I went. Grandma would point to them and say, "These are your roots, Ava. This is where you come from." I would nod, feeling a mixture of pride and responsibility, though I was still too young to understand the full weight of it. But there was one story Grandma didn't tell me until I was much older, the story of my inheritance. It wasn't until I was in my late teens, on the cusp of adulthood, that she sat me down in the drawing room one evening, the air thick with the scent of old books and faded memories, and told me about the money my mother had left for me. I could see the strain in her eyes as she spoke, the worry lines deepening on her face. "Your mother wanted to make sure you'd be taken care of," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "She left you a substantial sum. When you turn 21, it will all be yours." The news hit me like a wave. I'd always known we were well off, but the idea that there was a part of my mother's legacy waiting for me felt almost surreal. It was like discovering a hidden treasure, a final gift from a woman I could barely remember but whose presence had always lingered in the corners of my mind. From that moment on, I became more aware of the subtle undercurrents around me. My stepmother, Sophia, began to take a keener interest in my life. She would visit occasionally, always with a polite smile, always asking questions that felt just a little too personal. She would probe, inquiring about my plans, my studies, even my friendships. It seemed innocent enough at first, but there was an edge to her curiosity that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't until one summer afternoon, during a rare visit from my father and Sophia, that the pieces started to fall into place. They had come for tea, a strained and awkward affair, as it always was. My father was distant, a mere shadow of the man I remembered, while Sophia took center stage, asking question after question, her eyes never leaving me. "So, Ava," she said, stirring her tea slowly, "I hear you'll be quite well off soon. Your grandmother mentioned something about an inheritance." Her words were like a knife, cutting through the quiet hum of polite conversation. I could feel Grandma tense beside me, her hand tightening around her cup. Sophia's tone was light, casual even, but I could see the glint in her eyes, the way her gaze lingered just a bit too long. It wasn't a question. It was a probe, a calculated move to see what I knew, to gauge my reaction. I nodded slowly, choosing my words carefully. "Yes, that's what I've been told." She smiled, a tight, cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well, it's good to know you'll be taken care of. Family wealth is a precious thing. It should stay within the family, don't you think?" I glanced at my father, hoping for some sign of support, but he was staring at his tea, lost in thought or perhaps simply avoiding the conversation altogether. It was as though he had resigned himself to the sidelines, content to let Sophia take the lead. That afternoon marked a turning point. Sophia's words lingered in my mind, a subtle warning that there was more at stake than I had realized. I began to pay closer attention to the way she interacted with me, The way her gaze would linger on the family portraits, her questions always circling back to the inheritance, to the family wealth. I started to wonder if her interest in me had ever been genuine, or if it was merely a calculated attempt to secure her place in the family's legacy. The thought gnawed at me, filling me with a deep sense of unease. I knew that my grandmother had been protecting me, shielding me from the worst of it, but I could sense the strain it was putting on her. I could see it in the way she would watch Sophia, her eyes sharp and wary, as though she could see through the facade that my stepmother had so carefully constructed. Despite the tension, I found solace in my grandmother's stories. She would regale me with tales of our ancestors, of the trials they had faced, the fortunes they had built, the legacies they had left behind. She made me feel connected to something greater than myself, a part of a long line of resilience and strength. I clung to those stories, drawing strength from them, even as I felt the world around me shifting, the foundation of my life slowly crumbling under the weight of secrets and lies. The more I learned about my inheritance, the more I realized the precarious position I was in. I was a young woman with a substantial fortune on the horizon, and it was becoming increasingly clear that I was surrounded by people who had their own agendas, their own desires. I started to understand that my father's abandonment had been just the beginning of a much larger story, one that was still unfolding, one in which I was both the protagonist and the prize. Through it all, my grandmother remained my anchor, the one person I could trust. She taught me how to navigate the complexities of our family, how to read between the lines, how to protect myself from those who would seek to use me. But even with her guidance, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on the edge of a precipice, teetering on the brink of something dark and dangerous. As the years passed, Sophia's interest in my inheritance became less subtle. She would drop hints during her visits, making veiled comments about the importance of family unity, about how I would need guidance and support when the time came to manage my wealth. She would cast glances at my father, as though willing him to step in, to assert some kind of influence over me. But he remained distant, detached, a mere spectator to the unfolding drama. I found myself growing more guarded, more suspicious. I could feel the pressure mounting, the tension simmering beneath the surface. I knew that Sophia was planning something, that she was waiting for the right moment to strike. And I knew that I had to be ready. The memory of my father's abandonment haunted me, a constant reminder of the fragility of family ties, of the ease with which love could be replaced by greed and ambition. I had spent my life trying to fill the void he had left, trying to make sense of a world that had been shattered by his departure. And now, as I stood on the cusp of inheriting a fortune, I realized that I was alone in this fight, that I could trust no one but myself. As the day of my inheritance approached, I could feel the storm gathering, the forces aligning against me. I was caught in the middle of a battle I hadn't chosen, a battle for control, for power, for the legacy that my mother had left behind. And though I was scared, I knew that I had to face it head-on, that I had to protect what was rightfully mine. For the first time in my life, I felt a spark of defiance, a flicker of strength that had been buried beneath years of doubt and fear. I would not be a pawn in their game. I would not be manipulated, not by Sophia, not by my father, not by anyone. This was my life, my inheritance, my legacy, and I was prepared to fight for it. I had been anticipating this moment, but it still took me by surprise when Sophia finally confronted me. She arrived unannounced one afternoon, sweeping into the house like she owned the place. The air around her seemed charged, her every step heavy with purpose. I'd been expecting her to make a move, but I hadn't expected it to be so direct, so audacious. She didn't waste any time on pleasantries. We stood in the drawing room, the same room where my grandmother had once told me about the inheritance that would one day be mine. The light filtering through the tall windows cast long shadows across the room, and I could feel the weight of my ancestors watching over me, their portraits lining the walls like silent witnesses. "Ava," Sophia began, her voice icy and composed, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about the family finances." I crossed my arms, meeting her gaze with a defiance that I hadn't known I was capable of until that moment. "I'm listening," she smiled, but it was a cold, calculating smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "As you know, Your father and I have been working hard to maintain the family's wealth. It hasn't been easy, especially with the burdens he's had to bear since your mother's passing. The mention of my mother was a calculated move, and I felt a surge of anger rise within me. Go on. She took a step closer, her eyes narrowing as she spoke. Your father has debts, Ava. Substantial ones. I don't expect you to understand the complexities of financial management, but the fact remains that he needs help. And as a family, we should be willing to support each other. The implication hung heavily in the air. She was asking for my inheritance. No, demanding it. I shook my head, barely able to contain my anger. You're asking me to give up what my mother left me. That money isn't yours, and it's not my father's. It's mine. Sophia's expression hardened, and I could see the flicker of frustration in her eyes. That money belongs to the family, Ava. It's not just about you. Your father has worked tirelessly to provide for you, and this is how you repay him? By refusing to help when he needs it most? Her words were sharp, cutting into me with precision, but I refused to back down. No, this is about you wanting control. You've been eyeing that inheritance for years. Don't pretend this is about loyalty or family obligations. It's about your greed. Sophia's face twisted in anger, the mask of politeness slipping away. You ungrateful child, she hissed. You have no idea what it takes to keep a family like this together. Your father deserves that money far more than you do. Do you think you've earned it? Do you think you're entitled to it simply because your mother left it to you? The words stung, but I held my ground. My mother wanted me to have it, and I'm not going to let you manipulate me into giving it up. For a moment, Sophia just stared at me, her eyes cold and calculating. Then, she turned and walked out of the room without another word, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. I felt a mixture of relief and dread, knowing that this wasn't the end. She wouldn't give up so easily. The days that followed were tense. I knew that Sophia was scheming, that she wouldn't let go of her ambitions so quickly. It wasn't long before the true extent of her plans became clear. One morning, I received a letter from her lawyer. It was a formal, intimidating document, filled with legal jargon that I struggled to understand. But the message was clear enough. Sophia was challenging my claim to the inheritance, alleging that my father had a right to the funds based on family debts and obligations. She was attempting to take my legacy through legal means, threatening to drag me into a lengthy court battle if I didn't comply. I felt the blood drain from my face as I read the letter, the weight of it pressing down on me like a stone. How had it come to this? How had my life been reduced to a legal battle over money that was rightfully mine? Desperate for guidance, I turned to my grandmother. She was the one person who had always stood by me, who had always protected me. I found her in the garden, pruning roses, her expression calm and serene. But when I showed her the letter, the calmness vanished, replaced by a steely determination that I hadn't seen in years. We won't let her win, she said firmly, her hands steady as she held the letter. This is your legacy, Ava. Your mother wanted you to have it, and no one, not Sophia, not even your father, has the right to take it from you. Her words were a balm to my soul, but the worry lingered. She's going to try everything she can, Grandma. She won't stop until she gets what she wants. My grandmother placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. Then we'll fight her. We'll fight her with everything we have. As the days went by, Sophia's tactics grew more ruthless. She began to spread rumors, insinuating that I was selfish, that I was refusing to help my own father in his time of need. She would show up at the house unannounced, making veiled comments about loyalty and family values, trying to guilt-trip me into compliance. The worst part was the impact it had on my relationship with my father. He had always been distant, but now, under Sophia's influence, he became even more withdrawn. When I tried to speak with him, to explain my side of things, he would brush me off, his eyes filled with a mixture of frustration and disappointment. Ava, he said one evening, his voice heavy with resignation, you need to think about what's best for the family. This inheritance, it's not just about you. It's about all of us. I felt a surge of betrayal, the sting of his words cutting deep. Do you even care about what my mother wanted? This isn't your money, Dad. It's mine. She left it for me, not for you. and certainly not for Sophia. He looked away, his expression unreadable. Sophia has done more for this family than you realize. She's been a steady presence, someone who's been there for me when I needed her most. She's right. This money could help us all. You're too young to understand the burdens we face. The argument escalated, with both of us saying things that we could never take back. In that moment, I realized just how deeply Sophia had driven a wedge between us, how skillfully she had manipulated the situation to turn my father against me. I could see the doubt in his eyes, the way he struggled to balance his loyalty to Sophia with his duty to me. But I couldn't give in. I wouldn't. The inheritance was more than just money. It was a symbol of my mother's love, a piece of her that she had left behind for me. And I wasn't going to let anyone take that from me. As the weeks passed, Sophia's pressure only intensified. She began to involve her lawyer more aggressively, sending a steady stream of letters and legal documents that I struggled to keep up with. I felt like I was drowning in paperwork, buried under a mountain of demands and threats that left me exhausted and demoralized. One evening, I sat down with my grandmother, poring over the latest stack of documents. She looked at me, her eyes filled with both sadness and determination. "Ava," she said gently, "you have to be strong. I know this is hard, but you're not alone. I'm here, and we'll get through this together." Her words gave me strength, but I could feel the strain taking its toll. I had never wanted to be part of a battle like this, never imagined that I would have to defend my mother's legacy from my own family. But I was learning, slowly but surely, how to fight back. I started seeking advice from family friends, people who had known my mother and who understood the complexities of our family's wealth. I learned about trusts, about legal protections, about ways to safeguard my inheritance from those who would seek to exploit it. With each new piece of knowledge, I felt a little more empowered, a little more prepared to face whatever Sophia threw at me. Yet, through it all, the nagging feeling of betrayal remained. I couldn't shake the sense that I was losing something far more valuable than money. I was losing my family, losing the connection to my father that I had always held on to, even after he had left. I was losing the illusion of loyalty, the belief that we could somehow weather this storm together. As the tension between me and Sophia reached a boiling point, I realized that this fight wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about control, about independence, about standing up for myself in the face of manipulation and greed. And as much as it hurt, I knew that I had to see it through to the end. The legal threats, the veiled accusations, the coldness from my father. It was all part of a game that I had been forced into, a game that I had no choice but to play. But I was ready. I was ready to fight for what was mine, to protect the legacy that my mother had entrusted to me. And no matter what Sophia did, no matter how hard she tried to tear me down, I knew that I wouldn't back down. I had my grandmother by my side, and I had the strength that came from knowing I was fighting for something bigger than myself. This was my life, my future, and I was determined to hold on to it, no matter the cost. Sophia's intentions had become clear, and I knew I couldn't simply wait for her next move. She'd already managed to manipulate my father and had made legal threats against me. I needed to find a way to expose her for who she truly was. It wasn't just about protecting my inheritance anymore. It was about unearthing the truth. I began my search in the most obvious place, Sophia's past. She had always been guarded about her life before marrying my father, but I remembered snippets she'd let slip at family gatherings. Stories of living in different cities, mentions of ex-husbands that were quickly glossed over. My grandmother had always looked skeptical whenever Sophia started talking about her past, but I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, those stories seemed less like casual anecdotes and more like the pieces of a puzzle I needed to solve. I started with public records, digging up whatever I could find on her previous marriages. The process was tedious, but it was worth it. It didn't take long for a pattern to emerge. I found records of 3 previous marriages, all of which had ended abruptly and with financial ruin for her former husbands. One man had filed for bankruptcy, another had lost his family business, and the third had reportedly been swindled out of a significant portion of his savings before the marriage ended. It was enough to make my blood run cold. Each marriage had left a trail of financial devastation, with Sophia walking away unscathed every time. The more I read, the more convinced I became that this was no coincidence. She wasn't just a gold digger. She was a con artist. I knew I couldn't confront her directly. She was too cunning, too adept at twisting situations to her advantage. I needed leverage, something I could use to protect myself and to open my father's eyes to the truth. I needed someone with experience, someone who knew Sophia's type, who could help me dig deeper and build a case against her. That's when I remembered Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett was an old friend of my mother's, a retired attorney who had known our family for years. He had been a steady presence in my life, someone who had always been there in the background, offering quiet support when needed. I remembered him speaking at my mother's funeral, his voice filled with emotion as he recounted stories of their friendship. If there was anyone who could help me now, it was him. I reached out to him, explaining everything that had happened, from Sophia's demands to the legal threats, and the troubling information I had uncovered about her past. He listened quietly, his expression growing graver with each word. When I finished, he nodded, a determined look in his eyes. "Your mother was a dear friend, Ava," he said, his voice steady. "If Sophia is who you say she is, then we have to stop her. Let's see what we can find." Together, we began to dig deeper into Sophia's affairs. Mr. Bennett had access to resources and legal connections that I could only dream of, and he quickly uncovered documents that painted an even darker picture than I had anticipated. Sophia had been quietly moving family assets into accounts under her name. She had been siphoning money from family funds, likely in preparation for a swift exit, once she had taken everything she could get. One evening, as we pored over the documents in Mr. Bennett's study, he handed me a thick file filled with records, bank statements, and correspondence. I scanned through them, each page confirming my worst fears. Sophia had been planning this for months, maybe even years. She had used my father, gained his trust, and then systematically drained him of resources. "We have enough here to confront her," Mr. Bennett said, his voice low but firm. "But your father needs to be aware of this. He has to know what she's done." My heart sank at the thought. I knew he wouldn't believe me. Sophia had poisoned our relationship so thoroughly that he barely looked at me anymore, much less listened to anything I had to say. But I had to try. I couldn't let her continue manipulating him, stealing from him under the guise of love and loyalty. I arranged to meet my father at a quiet cafe, far from prying eyes and ears. I could tell from the moment he arrived that he was reluctant to be there. He barely looked at me, his gaze fixed somewhere over my shoulder as he sat down, his posture stiff and guarded. "I need to talk to you about Sophia," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "There are things you don't know about her. I've done some digging and—" He cut me off, his expression hardening. "I don't want to hear it, Ava. You've made it perfectly clear how you feel about her. But you're letting your resentment cloud your judgment. Sophia has done nothing but try to help this family. She's lying to you." I protested, feeling a surge of desperation. "She's been moving assets, stealing from you. I have proof." He shook his head, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "I don't believe you. You've never accepted her, never given her a chance. She's your stepmother, Ava. She's family. And I won't stand here and listen to you slander her like this." His words were like a knife to the heart. I had expected resistance, but I hadn't expected this level of betrayal. He was so deeply under Sophia's spell that he couldn't see the truth, even when it was right in front of him. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Please, just look at the documents." Mr. Bennett and I found evidence. Bank statements, transfers, everything. "If you just take a look, you'll see that she's been deceiving you." But he refused. He wouldn't even glance at the files I held out to him. He simply stood up, his face set in a mask of cold indifference. "I don't need to see anything," he said quietly. "If you want to fight this battle, that's your choice. But don't expect my support." With that, he walked away, leaving me standing alone, the weight of his betrayal pressing down on me like a physical force. I had always known that my father was weak, that he had a tendency to let others influence him. But this was beyond anything I had imagined. He had chosen Sophia over his own daughter, over the truth. Heartbroken but more determined than ever, I returned to Mr. Bennett. He was waiting for me, his expression somber but resolute. I take it he didn't believe you, he said, reading the look on my face. I nodded, fighting back tears. He's completely under her spell. He won't listen to a word I say, Mr. Bennett sighed, placing a comforting hand on my shoulder. Then we'll have to go public. We have enough evidence to expose her, to force her to back down. But it won't be easy. She's clever and she'll fight back. I'm ready, I replied, my voice filled with a determination that surprised even me. I won't let her take everything. Not my inheritance, not my family's legacy, not my life. In the days that followed, Mr. Bennett and I worked tirelessly to prepare our case. We gathered every piece of evidence we could find, building a comprehensive file that outlined Sophia's deceptions, her history of manipulation, her pattern of financial abuse. It was grueling work, but with each new piece of information, I felt a sense of empowerment that I hadn't felt before. I was no longer just a pawn in Sophia's game. I was fighting back, reclaiming control over my own life. We took our case to the family's financial advisor, a man who had worked with my grandmother for years and who held a deep respect for our family's legacy. He was shocked by the evidence, but he promised to support us, to help us expose Sophia for who she truly was. And as we prepared to confront her, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I knew that this battle wasn't just about protecting my inheritance. It was about standing up for myself, about proving to everyone, including my father, that I was strong enough to face whatever came my way. The confrontation was coming, and I was ready. Sophia had underestimated me, just as she had underestimated the strength of the legacy my mother had left behind. She thought she could manipulate her way into my family's wealth, but she was about to learn just how wrong she was. I wasn't going to let her steal my future. I was going to fight, and I was going to win. The day of the confrontation had finally arrived. Mr. Bennett and I had spent countless hours preparing, gathering every piece of evidence, every document, every damning piece of Sophia's dark past. I felt a mixture of anxiety and determination, but as I stood outside my father's study, I knew there was no turning back. This was my chance to reclaim my future and protect my family's legacy. My father was waiting inside, looking uneasy. I had asked him to meet with me and Mr. Bennett, insisting that it was urgent. I could see the confusion and tension in his eyes as he glanced between us. He still hadn't grasped the gravity of what was about to unfold, but he was about to. Sophia entered moments later, her expression guarded but confident. She had no idea what was coming, and for a moment, I almost felt a twinge of pity. But then I remembered everything she had done. Every lie, every manipulation, every attempt to steal what was mine, and the pity vanished. "Ava, what's this all about?" my father asked, looking at me with a mixture of impatience and worry. "What's so important that we had to meet like this?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Dad, you need to know the truth about Sophia. I found some things you need to see." Sophia's eyes narrowed, a flash of irritation crossing her face. "What are you talking about, Ava? This is ridiculous." I ignored her, handing my father the stack of documents that Mr. Bennett and I had compiled. I watched as he skimmed the pages, his eyes growing wider with each piece of evidence he read. Bank statements showing unauthorized transfers, correspondence revealing secret accounts, records of her previous marriages, and the financial devastation she had left in her wake. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, his face paling with each revelation. "Sophia, what is this?" Sophia's composure cracked, but only for a moment. She quickly regained her usual poise, shaking her head as if to dismiss it all. "It's nothing, John. These are just misunderstandings, taken out of context. Ava is trying to make me look bad, trying to tear this family apart." "Am I?" I challenged, stepping forward. "Is this all just a misunderstanding? Because it looks pretty clear to me. You've been moving family assets, stealing from Dad, just like you did to all your other husbands. I have the records, Sophia. You can't deny it." Sophia's mask began to slip as she realized the depth of the trap we had set for her. She glanced at Mr. Bennett, her eyes narrowing. "You were in on this, too?" Mr. Bennett didn't flinch. "I'm here to protect Ava's interests. Your deceitful actions have left us with no choice." My father looked back at Sophia, a mix of betrayal and disbelief etched into his face. Is it true, Sophia? All these years, have you been lying to me? Sophia's bravado finally crumbled. She opened her mouth, struggling to find the right words, but no excuses came. The weight of the evidence was too much, and I could see the panic rising in her eyes. She knew she had been caught, and there was no way out. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she muttered, her voice barely a whisper. I was trying to protect us, John. I did what I had to do. Protect us? I repeated, my voice sharp. You were protecting yourself. You didn't care about Dad, about our family, about anyone but yourself. You're nothing but a fraud, and now everyone can see it. The room fell into silence as Sophia finally looked down, defeated. My father's face crumpled, and I could see the devastation in his eyes as he absorbed the truth. He looked at Sophia as if she were a stranger, and in that moment, I realized how much he had lost too. He had been betrayed, manipulated, and lied to by someone he thought he could trust. Get out, he said, his voice low but firm. I want you out of this house. Now. Sophia's eyes flashed with anger, but she knew she had no choice. She turned to leave, her footsteps echoing through the hall as she made her way out of our lives. As the door closed behind her, I felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. The battle was over, but the scars remained. My father sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. I could feel the weight of his grief, the realization of how thoroughly he had been deceived. I wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but I wasn't sure how. We had both been hurt, both been betrayed, and the road to healing felt long and uncertain. I'm sorry, he whispered, finally looking up at me. His eyes were red, filled with remorse. I should have believed you. I should have seen it sooner. I sat down beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. It's not your fault, Dad. She fooled us all. But we're going to be okay. We still have each other. He nodded, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I don't deserve your forgiveness, Ava. I let her come between us, and I almost lost you because of it. I took a deep breath, feeling a wave of emotions wash over me. We've both made mistakes, but we can rebuild. We can protect what Mom left us together. We spent the rest of the day talking, sharing stories, and reconnecting in a way we hadn't in years. It was as if a wall had finally been torn down, allowing us to see each other clearly for the first time. The years of distance, of mistrust, of hurt, they all began to fade, replaced by a renewed sense of closeness, of family. Over the following weeks, my father and I worked to repair the damage that Sophia had done. We met with financial advisors, secured my inheritance, and made plans for the future. With Mr. Bennett's guidance, we were able to protect our assets, ensuring that the legacy my mother had left behind would remain intact. It wasn't easy. The memories of Sophia's deception lingered, casting shadows over our lives. But we faced them together, drawing strength from each other, and from the love that had always been there, even when we had been too blind to see it. One afternoon, as we walked through the garden, my father turned to me, a look of quiet determination in his eyes. Your mother would be proud of you, Ava. You stood up for yourself, for our family. You protected her legacy, and I have no doubt you'll carry it on with honor. I smiled, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded me for so long. Thank you, Dad. I think she'd be proud of both of us. With Sophia gone, the house felt lighter, free of the tension and deceit that had plagued us for so long. I spent more time with my father, learning about the family history, the stories my grandmother had shared with him. We found comfort in each other, in the bond that had been forged through hardship and strengthened through the battle we had faced together. In the end, Sophia's departure marked not just the end of a chapter, but the beginning of a new one. I had fought for my inheritance, for my family, for the legacy my mother had entrusted to me. And though the fight had been hard, it had taught me invaluable lessons about resilience, about trust, and about the strength that lies within us when we're pushed to the brink. As I stood in the garden one evening, watching the sun set over the house that had been my home for so many years, I felt a sense of closure. I was no longer the abandoned little girl waiting for her father to come back. I was no longer the anxious young woman struggling to hold on to what was rightfully hers. I had faced my demons, confronted the shadows, and emerged stronger on the other side. The legacy my mother had left me was safe, and I was ready to carry it forward, knowing that I had the strength, the courage, and the support of the family that mattered most. I took a deep breath, savoring the calm that had finally settled over my life. The storm had passed, and in its wake, I had found not just closure, but a new beginning. The future was mine, and I was ready to embrace it with open arms, confident in the knowledge that I was capable of protecting everything I held dear. If you like this story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments. Golden child brother sabotaged my career. Parents helped him cover it up, then they asked to put it all behind them. But what I did next? I'm Jason, 29 years old. If you told me 10 years ago where I'd be today, I wouldn't have believed you. A kid from a modest background making it big in finance? It sounded more like a dream than a possibility. But here I am, living in Philadelphia, working for one of the most reputable firms in the industry. In just 6 years, I've built a reputation that others spend decades trying to achieve. It hasn't been easy. Late nights, endless pressure, and constant scrutiny come with the territory, but for me, it's always been worth it. Every deal closed, every milestone reached, it's all fueled by something deep inside me. A hunger to prove myself, to prove to my family, and maybe even to myself, that I'm more than what they thought of me growing up. Growing up, my family was tight-knit in the way that a dysfunctional team might be, tied together by necessity, not love. My parents, Richard and Linda, never treated my brother Eric and me the same. Eric, 5 years older than me, was their golden child. No matter what he did, they found a way to excuse it. Bad grades? It was the teacher's fault. Skipping class? He was too smart to sit through boring lectures. And when he did the bare minimum, they'd throw a parade for him. For me, it was the opposite. I worked my tail off to get straight A's, but all I heard was, "Don't get cocky," or "You're only as good as your last report card." If I made a mistake, they pounced on it. I'd get lectures about responsibility, how I needed to set an example for Eric, and how I had to work harder if I wanted to achieve anything in life. That double standard burned itself into me, shaping how I saw the world. I've always been competitive, but not in the way Eric is. He competes by pulling others down, while I've always believed in lifting myself up. Maybe that's why I found so much success early in my career. The rejection and indifference I faced at home hardened me, made me more focused, but it also made me feel like an outsider in my own family. Things came to a head last Thanksgiving. I just finished a grueling quarter at work and was looking forward to relaxing, even if it meant dealing with my family. Eric was there, of course, sipping beer on the couch while my parents fawned over him. At some point during dinner, he turned to me with this smug grin and said, "So, Jason, how's the corporate grind? Still crunching numbers and draining souls?" The table erupted in laughter. Even my parents chuckled. I forced a laugh, brushing it off like it didn't sting. But it did. It wasn't just the jab. It was the way everyone joined in, like it was perfectly fine to mock what I'd worked so hard for. After dinner, Eric cornered me in the kitchen. "Hear about the layoffs at your firm?" he asked, almost too casually. "You worried?" I wasn't. My role was secure, or so I thought at the time. I gave him a quick response and moved on, but something about the way he asked lingered. How did he know about the layoffs? It wasn't public knowledge, and I hadn't mentioned it to anyone in the family. In the following weeks, things at work started to feel off. Emails I'd sent seemed to vanish into thin air. Meetings I was supposed to attend were rescheduled without my knowledge. My colleagues started treating me differently, polite but distant, like they knew something I didn't. At first, I chalked it up to office politics. Every workplace has its quirks, and finance is notorious for cutthroat competition. But then it got worse. I'd been eyeing a promotion for months. My boss, Michelle, had hinted that I was the top contender. I'd gone above and beyond to prove myself, taking on extra projects and even mentoring new hires. Then, out of nowhere, the promotion went to someone else. When I asked Michelle for feedback, she avoided my gaze. "There were concerns about your professionalism," she said. "Specifically, a rumor that you'd been speaking negatively about colleagues to clients." I was stunned. I'd never badmouthed anyone, let alone to a client. When I pressed her for details, she shook her head. The decision's been made. Let's focus on moving forward. Moving forward? How was I supposed to do that when my reputation had been dragged through the mud? The paranoia set in after that. These weren't random coincidences. Someone was targeting me, but I couldn't figure out who or why. I started double-checking everything, emails, meetings, even casual conversations. But the harder I looked for answers, the more elusive they became. Eric's weird comment at Thanksgiving kept replaying in my mind. It felt absurd to think he had anything to do with my work troubles. How could he? He didn't know the first thing about my industry. Yet, every time I saw him, he dropped little remarks about my job, specific details he shouldn't have known. At Christmas, he mentioned a new client my firm had just signed in the tech sector. I'd only learned about it the day before in a private meeting. When I asked how he knew, he just smirked. "Read it online," he said. Meanwhile, Eric's life seemed to take a sharp turn for the better. He started showing up in designer clothes, talking about an upcoming vacation to Greece. This was a guy who couldn't keep a job for more than 6 months. Where was the money coming from? "Looks like someone hit the jackpot," I joked during one family dinner. Eric's face darkened. "I've been saving," he snapped, his tone defensive. "Not that it's any of your business." My parents, of course, rushed to his side. "He's finally getting his life together," my mom said, beaming. "You should be happy for him." Happy? I didn't know what I felt. Uneasy, maybe. Suspicious. But mostly, I felt like an outsider again, watching a play where everyone knew their roles except me. The final straw came one quiet evening at home. I was sorting through my emails when I found one in my junk folder. It looked like spam at first, poorly written, full of vague phrases about mutual benefits and confidential operations, but one line stopped me cold. "Your brother's agreement with our firm has been most beneficial." I stared at the screen, my mind racing. It didn't make sense, but deep down, I knew this wasn't a mistake. This was personal, and somehow, Eric was at the center of it. That night, I realized I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Someone was trying to destroy everything I'd worked for, and if I didn't act soon, they'd succeed. I had to find out the truth, no matter what it cost me. The night I found that email, I barely slept. My thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion, anger, and doubt. Could Eric really be involved in this? If so, why? What did he stand to gain by sabotaging me? And even more unsettling, was he acting alone? The next morning, I decided to dig deeper. I started by combing through every email, document, and message I'd saved on my work laptop. Most of it was routine, client updates, internal memos, meeting notes, but a few things stood out. There were emails I didn't remember sending, phrased in ways I'd never write. One, in particular, caught my attention. It was addressed to a client and included a line about frustrations with unprofessional colleagues. That wasn't me. I printed it out, along with anything else that looked suspicious, and stashed the papers in a drawer. If someone was impersonating me, I needed evidence to clear my name. But even as I tried to focus on work, I couldn't shake the feeling that the answers I needed weren't in my office. They were at home, or rather, with my family. The following weekend, I visited my parents under the pretense of helping them with their slow computer. I wasn't planning to snoop. I just wanted to see if anything seemed off. My parents had always been terrible with technology, so I figured they wouldn't notice if I poked around a bit. As I scrolled through their laptop, I stumbled upon something I hadn't expected. A shared bank statement left open in a browser tab. I wasn't trying to be nosy, but the details jumped out at me. There were regular transfers labeled Support Fund going directly to Eric's account. The amounts weren't small, thousands of dollars each month. "Hey, what's this?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. My dad glanced over from the kitchen, where he was making tea. "Oh, just some help for your brother," he said, shrugging. "You know he's been struggling. We're just giving him a little boost." A little boost? That boost was more than I made in a month when I first started my career. "Must be nice," I muttered, unable to hide the bitterness in my voice. My mom gave me one of her patented disapproving looks. "Don't start, Jason. He's had a tough time, and we're just trying to level the playing field." Level the playing field. That phrase hit me like a punch to the gut. For as long as I could remember, my parents had treated Eric's shortcomings as obstacles to overcome while dismissing my successes as luck or arrogance. Now, they were literally paying him to catch up to me. I left their house that day more convinced than ever that Eric was involved in the chaos at work. The timing of those payments was too perfect to ignore. They'd started just a few months before the first signs of trouble at my job, but I needed proof. The next morning, I called a private investigator. It felt extreme, even paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being targeted. If Eric was behind this, I needed more than just suspicions to confront him, or to protect myself. The PI worked fast. Within a week, they uncovered something that left me speechless. Eric had been sending emails to one of my company's competitors, sharing detailed information about our projects and clients. But that wasn't the worst part. He'd written the emails as if they were from me. I couldn't believe it. My own brother had gone out of his way to sabotage me, framing me as the source of the leaks. Armed with this new information, I decided it was time to confront Eric directly. I showed up at his apartment unannounced, my heart pounding as I knocked on the door. He answered in sweatpants and a designer hoodie, holding a glass of wine like he didn't have a care in the world. "Jason," he said, flashing that smug grin I'd grown to hate. "What brings you here?" "We need to talk," I said, stepping past him into the living room without waiting for an invitation. He followed me, still grinning. "What's up? You look tense." I took a deep breath and pulled out the printed emails. "Care to explain these?" His grin faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "What are you talking about?" "You've been sending confidential information to a competitor," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "And you've been pretending to be me while doing it. Don't even try to deny it. I have proof." Eric laughed, a short, sharp sound that made my blood boil. "You've lost it," he said. "Seriously, Jason, you're working too hard. Maybe take a vacation or something. Don't play games with me." I snapped. "I know what you've been doing, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." His expression shifted then. The smugness melted away, replaced by something darker. "You always think you're better than me," he said quietly, setting his glass down. "Always the golden boy, always ahead. Maybe I just wanted to show you what it feels like to lose for once." I stared at him, stunned. I'd expected denial, excuses, anything but this. "How could you do this to me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged. "You're still standing, aren't you? What's the big deal?" The rage bubbling inside me threatened to boil over, but I held it back. "This isn't over," I said, turning to leave. "Oh, I think it is," he called after me. But he was wrong. That night, I decided to confront my parents next. They had to know something. They'd been funneling money to Eric for months. After all, when I brought up the bank transfers during a family dinner, they immediately got defensive. "We're just helping him get back on his feet," my mom said. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "And what about the emails he's been sending?" I asked, slamming the printed papers onto the table. "You're telling me you had no idea he was sabotaging me at work?" My dad frowned, his jaw tightening. "Eric wouldn't do something like that," he said firmly. "Then explain this," I said, pointing to the documents. For a moment, the room was silent. My parents exchanged a look, and I knew they were hiding something. "You're imagining things," my mom finally said. "You've been under a lot of stress lately, Jason. Maybe you should take some time off." Their dismissal felt like a slap in the face. They weren't just ignoring the evidence. They were defending Eric. I left their house feeling more alone than ever. But if they thought I was going to back down, they didn't know me at all. After the disastrous confrontation with Eric and the futile attempt to reason with my parents, I knew there was no turning back. The family dynamic I'd spent my whole life navigating had officially crumbled, and all I had left was my determination to uncover the full truth. The private investigator's findings gave me the foundation I needed to start piecing everything together. Eric hadn't just been sending emails to a competitor. He'd been impersonating me to do it. And my parents, despite their insistence otherwise, were directly funding his lifestyle. What I didn't know yet was how deep this conspiracy went or how far they were willing to go to see it through. That week at work, the situation took another turn for the worse. My boss, Michelle, called me into her office for yet another serious conversation. "We've had another complaint," she said, looking uncomfortable. "What now?" I asked, barely able to mask my frustration. "This time, it's about a leak," she said. "Someone's accused you of sharing sensitive information with a competitor." My stomach dropped. It was exactly what Eric had been doing, only now, the blame was landing squarely on me. "I didn't do it," I said firmly. "I don't know who's spreading these lies, but I can prove I'm not the one behind this." Michelle gave me a long, searching look. "Jason, I believe you," she said finally. "But these accusations are serious. If we can't get to the bottom of this, your position here could be at risk." That was the moment I realized I couldn't just play defense anymore. Whoever was targeting me, Eric, my parents, or all of them, wasn't going to stop until they'd ruined me completely. I needed to take the fight to them. The breakthrough came from an unexpected place. A few days after the meeting with Michelle, I received a message from someone I hadn't heard from in years, Samantha, Eric's ex-girlfriend. Her message was simple. "I think I have information that might help you. Can we talk?" I was skeptical at first. Samantha and Eric had broken up years ago, and as far as I knew, they hadn't spoken since. But something about the timing felt too coincidental to ignore. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop near her apartment. When I arrived, Samantha was already waiting at a corner table. She looked nervous, fiddling with her phone as I approached. "Thanks for coming," she said, offering a tentative smile. "Thanks for reaching out," I replied. "What's this about?" She took a deep breath and launched into her story. Apparently, during the time she and Eric were dating, he'd been open about his frustrations with me. He'd complained constantly about living in my shadow, about how our parents had always held him to a different standard while expecting me to succeed. "He always felt like he had something to prove," she said, sipping her coffee. "But I didn't realize how far he was willing to go until recently." Samantha explained that a mutual friend of theirs had mentioned Eric bragging about finally taking Jason down a notch. At first, she thought it was just talk, but then she started going through her old messages and found something alarming. Screenshots of texts between Eric and my parents, discussing ways to undermine me at work. "I don't know all the details," she said, handing me her phone, "but it sounds like your parents were more involved than you think." The screenshots were damning. In one, my dad suggested timing Eric's leaks to coincide with major projects at my company, knowing it would cause the most damage. In another, my mom expressed concern that I might figure out what was happening and urged Eric to be more careful. Seeing those messages hit me like a freight train. It was one thing to suspect Eric of sabotaging me. It was another to see my parents actively plotting against me. "Why are you helping me?" I asked, struggling to process what I just read. Samantha shrugged. "Eric hurt a lot of people, including me. I guess I just wanted to do the right thing for once." With Samantha's help, I finally had the evidence I needed to confront my parents again. This time, I wasn't going to let them brush me off. The opportunity came during a visit to their house. I arrived unannounced, catching them off guard. My mom was in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, while my dad was in the living room watching TV. "We need to talk," I said, setting my bag down on the counter. My mom sighed. "Jason, if this is about Eric again..." "It is," I interrupted, pulling out the screenshots. "And this time I have proof." I handed the papers to my dad, who frowned as he skimmed through them. My mom glanced over his shoulder, her expression shifting from confusion to panic. "Where did you get these?" she demanded. "That doesn't matter," I said. "What matters is that you've been lying to me. You've been funding Eric's sabotage and helping him ruin my career." My dad set the papers down and folded his arms. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice defensive. "Oh, really? Then what is it?" I shot back. My mom started to speak, but I cut her off. "Don't even try to justify this," I said. "You've been working against me for months, maybe years. And for what? To make Eric feel better about himself?" "Jason, calm down," my dad said. "We were just trying to help your brother. He's had a hard time and what?" I demanded. "You thought destroying my life was the best way to fix his?" My mom's eyes filled with tears. "We didn't mean for it to go this far," she said. "We just wanted to level the playing field." There it was again. That phrase. You've been saying that my whole life, I said, my voice shaking. But this isn't about fairness. It's about enabling Eric at my expense. I'm done being the scapegoat for this family. Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my bag and walked out the door. That night, I sent everything I had, the screenshots, the emails, the PI's report, to my lawyer. I wasn't sure what my next move would be, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. The fallout started almost immediately. My parents called me the next day, begging me to reconsider. They claimed they'd only acted out of love, that they'd never intended to hurt me. But their excuses fell flat. I hung up on them and blocked their numbers. As for Eric, he sent me a series of messages ranging from sarcastic jabs to outright threats. "You think you're so perfect," one read, "but you're just as screwed up as the rest of us." Another simply said, "Watch your back." It was clear that things were only going to get worse before they got better. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was finally in control. The truth was out, and I wasn't going to stop until I had justice. After my confrontation with my parents, things started unraveling quickly. They had always been the rock of my family, or so I'd thought. But now their actions were catching up with them. While I focused on gathering evidence and protecting myself, their carefully constructed facade of a supportive, respectable family began to crumble. It started with work. Armed with the evidence I'd collected, emails, screenshots, and the investigator's report, I scheduled a meeting with Michelle, my boss. This time, I wasn't going to hold back. When I sat down in her office, I laid everything out in front of her. The emails Eric had sent pretending to be me, the proof of his communications with our competitor, and even evidence tying my parents to his scheme. As I explained each piece, Michelle's expression shifted from confusion to shock. "This is incredible," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Jason, why didn't you come forward with this sooner?" "I didn't know how deep it went until recently," I admitted. "I didn't want to accuse anyone without proof, but now that I have it, I need to clear my name." Michelle nodded, picking up one of the printouts. "This changes everything," she said. "We'll launch an internal investigation immediately. In the meantime, I'll make sure these accusations against you are dismissed." For the first time in months, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't over yet, but at least I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. Word spread quickly within the company. The same colleagues who had been keeping their distance suddenly started reaching out, apologizing for believing the rumors. One even confessed that they'd overheard whispers about Eric's involvement, but hadn't known how to bring it up. People were scared, they said. No one wanted to get caught in the crossfire. But now that we know the truth, we're behind you. Their support meant more to me than I could express, but it also fueled my resolve to see this through to the end. While things were starting to improve at work, the situation with my family was spiraling out of control. One evening, I received a call from a distant relative, a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years. "Jason, I don't know how to say this," she began hesitantly, "but there's a lot of talk going around the family about you and your parents." "Talk?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "Apparently, your parents have been telling people that you're overreacting, that you're trying to tear the family apart for no reason," she said. "They're playing the victim, saying they only wanted to help Eric and you've blown it out of proportion." I felt my blood boil. Of course, they were trying to spin the narrative in their favor. It was classic Richard and Linda: deflect, deny, and make themselves the victims. "Thanks for letting me know," I said, "but I'm done worrying about what they think. The truth will come out soon enough." It didn't take long for that truth to start making waves. The investigator uncovered more evidence that not only implicated Eric, but also exposed my parents' broader financial mismanagement. They hadn't just been funneling money to Eric. They'd been dipping into a shared inheritance account for years, using the funds for personal expenses and to cover up their involvement in Eric's sabotage. The findings were enough to warrant legal action. With my lawyer's help, I filed a lawsuit against Eric for defamation and began proceedings to recover the misused funds from my parents. It wasn't just about the money. It was about holding them accountable for what they'd done. The backlash from my parents was immediate. They called me, begging me to drop the lawsuit. "We're family," my mom said, her voice trembling. "You can't do this to us. You should have thought about that before you tried to ruin my life," I replied coldly. My dad tried a different approach, threatening to cut me out of their will if I didn't back down. I almost laughed. "You've already stolen from me," I said. "What's left to lose?" As the legal battle unfolded, their reputation in the community took a nosedive. Word about the financial mismanagement and sabotage started circulating among their social circle, thanks in part to a small news outlet that picked up on the story. My parents went from being well-respected pillars of the community to social pariahs. My dad resigned from his position on the neighborhood association board, and my mom stopped attending her weekly book club. They retreated into their home, isolating themselves from the world they'd once been so proud to be part of. Meanwhile, Eric's life was falling apart in its own way. The company he worked for caught wind of his actions and launched their own investigation. It didn't take long for them to uncover evidence that he'd been using company resources to assist in his scheme against me. He was fired on the spot, leaving him without a steady income or any way to maintain the lifestyle he'd been flaunting. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he was struggling to make ends meet, applying for jobs and being turned down at every turn. His flashy clothes and expensive trips were a thing of the past, replaced by a desperate scramble to stay afloat. Part of me felt a twisted sense of satisfaction, seeing him face the consequences of his actions. But another part of me felt nothing. He'd made his choices, and now he was living with them. Through it all, I found support in unexpected places. Cousins I hadn't been close to reached out, offering words of encouragement and sharing stories about how they'd also felt overlooked or dismissed by my parents. Friends rallied around me, inviting me into their families for holidays and reminding me that I wasn't as alone as I'd felt. The restitution payments from my parents and Eric provided a financial cushion I hadn't expected, allowing me to rebuild and move forward. It wasn't about the money. It was about knowing they couldn't walk away from this unscathed. At work, things were better than ever. Michelle and the leadership team recognized my resilience throughout the ordeal and offered me a promotion, a leadership role that cemented my position at the company. It was a moment of validation, proof that no matter how much they tried to tear me down, I'd come out stronger. As for my parents, they tried one last time to reconcile. They showed up at my apartment unannounced, looking older and more worn than I'd ever seen them. "We're sorry, Jason," my mom said, tears streaming down her face. "We just want our family back." I stared at them for a long moment before responding. "You lost your family the moment you decided to betray me," I said. "This isn't something you can fix with an apology." I shut the door, leaving them standing on the doorstep. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. With my career back on track and my parents' influence firmly out of my life, I felt like I was finally free to focus on the future. I didn't know what was coming next, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to find out. Leaving behind the wreckage of my family felt like shedding a heavy, suffocating skin. For years, I'd carried the weight of their expectations, manipulations, and betrayals. Now, with the lawsuits concluded and the truth fully revealed, I had no intention of looking back. I moved to a new city, Boston this time. The crisp, bustling streets offered me a fresh start, far away from the whispers of my old life. The position I'd accepted at a prestigious financial firm wasn't just a job. It was a chance to redefine myself in an environment where no one knew my history. Starting over wasn't easy. Even though my reputation had been restored, the scars from the ordeal lingered. I found myself second-guessing people's intentions, wondering if there was always another betrayal hiding around the corner. But as I settled into my new life, I began to meet people who showed me that trust could be rebuilt, piece by piece. One of my first new friends was Mark, a colleague who'd recently transferred from New York. Mark had a knack for spotting when someone was struggling. Over coffee one day, he asked me why I always seemed so guarded. I hesitated before answering, unsure of how much to share. But something about his sincerity made me open up. "It's a long story," I said, staring into my cup. "Let's just say my family situation is complicated." Mark nodded without pressing further. "Well, complicated or not, you've got people here who have your back now. Just remember that." His words stuck with me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I started to believe that I didn't have to face everything alone. Professionally, things were better than I could have imagined. My leadership role at the new firm gave me opportunities to shine in ways I hadn't before. I spearheaded projects that earned national recognition, and within a year, I was featured in an industry publication as one of Boston's rising stars. Seeing my name in print tied to something positive felt surreal. After everything my family had done to tarnish my reputation, here I was, proving that their efforts hadn't defined me. It was more than a victory, it was a reclaiming of my identity. Back home, the fallout from my parents' and Eric's actions continued to ripple through their lives. I heard through mutual acquaintances that my parents had sold their house, downsizing to a modest apartment in a less affluent area. The financial fraud charges had left them drained, both financially and socially. "They're not the same," one distant cousin told me during a call. "Your mom barely leaves the house anymore, and your dad's not on any of his old committees. It's like they've disappeared." I felt no joy in hearing about their downfall, only a cold detachment. They had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. Eric, too, was struggling. His reputation was in shambles, and his name had become a warning in professional circles. He'd burned through whatever savings he had left and was reportedly living paycheck to paycheck. The last I heard, he'd taken a job at a small company outside of Philadelphia, far from the industry he'd once dreamed of dominating. Despite their hardships, my parents and Eric continued to reach out to me. Letters and emails came sporadically, each one laced with apologies that felt more self-serving than sincere. "We miss you," one letter from my mom read. "We made mistakes, but families forgive each other. It's time to put this behind us." I never responded. There was no putting this behind us. What they had done wasn't a simple mistake. It was a deliberate betrayal that had nearly destroyed me. Forgiving them would have meant erasing the pain they caused, and I wasn't willing to do that. In the meantime, my own life continued to blossom. I joined local organizations and started volunteering at a mentorship program for young professionals. Giving back to others reminded me of why I'd worked so hard in the first place, not just to succeed, but to create opportunities for those who came after me. One of the most profound moments came during a panel discussion at an industry conference. I'd been invited to speak about resilience in the face of adversity. As I stood on the stage, looking out at the audience, I shared parts of my story, not the sordid family drama, but the lessons I'd learned about perseverance and integrity. Afterward, a young woman approached me with tears in her eyes. "Your story really resonated with me," she said. "I've been going through something similar with my family, and hearing you talk about setting boundaries made me realize it's okay to put myself first." Her words brought a lump to my throat. If sharing my experiences could help someone else find their strength, then maybe all the pain I'd endured hadn't been for nothing. The restitution payments from Eric and my parents eventually stopped coming, not because I forgave the debt, but because they simply couldn't pay anymore. My lawyer advised me to pursue further legal action, but I declined. I didn't need their money. I was already rebuilding my life on my own terms. As time went on, I found peace in the distance I'd created from my family. My new circle of friends became my chosen family, people who lifted me up instead of tearing me down. Holidays were spent with them, sharing laughter and warmth that had always been absent from my childhood. One day, as I was unpacking boxes in my new apartment, I came across an old photo album my mom had given me years ago. Flipping through the pages, I saw images of a younger me, smiling next to Eric at birthdays and vacations. The memories felt like they belonged to someone else, a version of myself who hadn't yet learned what family could mean. I closed the album and placed it back in the box. Those moments were part of my history, but they didn't define my future. The last piece of the puzzle fell into place when a distant relative sent me a letter. She'd read about my story in the news and wanted to share her own experiences with toxic family dynamics. "I felt so trapped for years," she wrote, "but seeing how you stood up for yourself has given me the courage to do the same. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to start over." Her words stayed with me. They reminded me that the pain and betrayal I'd endured weren't the end of my story. They were the beginning of something new. Looking back, it's hard to believe how far I've come. The family that once tried to tear me down is no longer a part of my life, but in their absence, I've built something stronger. My career, my friendships, my sense of self. All of it has flourished in ways I never thought possible. This chapter of my life is closed, and while it wasn't the story I would have chosen, it's one I've come to own. I'm no longer the outsider in my own family. I've created a new family, one built on trust, respect, and love. And for the first time, I feel truly free.